We're together this evening to talk about vocation, and who better as a guest to help us to do that than our own Canon David Morris, who, as well as his ministry with us in the cathedral, has as his substantive ministry within the diocese the role of director of ministry, which includes taking care of our ordinands and running our vocational processes for ordained and lay licensed ministries within the diocese. And we're meeting with Father David after the very successful celebration almost of our Vocations Sunday within the diocese during Eastertide, when we were encouraged in the cathedral, thanks to our leader Elmer Taylor's sermons on that day, and across the diocese, in person and through a range of new online material to engage with what vocation might mean for each one of us, but with a particular focus on a calling to ministry within the life of the church. David, I wanted to get into what vocation has meant practically for you and for me and for others you've had care for. But I wonder whether we might begin a little bit theoretically and define our terms, so to speak. When somebody says vocation as a word to you, what do you hear? What does it mean to you? And what's it as a frame of reference for us who are going to be reflecting on it this evening?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the word vocation finds its root in the Latin vocare, which means to call. And so I suppose a vocation is a sense of being drawn to something. And I suppose we discern what that something is by sort of wrestling inwardly in ourselves, looking inwardly and asking ourselves, what are our talents and our gifts, our passions, what motivates us and drives us, and so those things lead us often into an awareness of what it is that we're being called to do. And of course, within the religious context, within the Christian tradition, we understand that calling to come from God, to find its source in God, and a calling that leads us into God, I suppose, into deeper relationship with God. And so, yeah, I think perhaps that's what I understand vocation to be, and a sense of becoming what we ought to be in God's eyes, a sort of a realizing of our God-given potential.
And defined like that, how closely to ministry, so to speak, would you want to be defining it? Are there perhaps two senses of vocation that we're playing with here? A sense within the life of the church in which we tend to talk about vocation to particular ministries within the life of the church, but also a broader sense in terms of the vocation of each one of us to find that which is at the core of what we're called to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think every person who is called to be a Christian is pursuing a vocation. So we are responding to the call of Christ to follow him in our lives, and so that's, we use the word discipleship for that in many ways. That sense of becoming a better Christian by deepening our prayer lives and nurturing our spirituality and faith in action, and all of those things that draw us deeper into a relationship with God. And so the Christian life is itself a vocational journey, but that in many people's lives manifests in other ways, in other types of ministry. And of course, there are ways in which our Christian life lives out in ways beyond the church. So in secular work contexts where we might feel that we've got a vocational call to something, so perhaps to teach, and that actually our Christian faith informs that, and I don't know, reveals itself through that. Yeah.
Let's talk about you and vocation. Tell us a bit about where that Christian vocation of closer discipleship came from for you, and tell us about how that developed into a vocation to ordained ministry.
So apologies to those who were at the Mothers Union talk this afternoon, where I was asked to talk about pretty much the same stuff. So a feeling of deja vu for some people on the Zoom call. But yeah, so I wasn't raised as a Christian. I suppose there were I think, as I described this afternoon, there were interactions with the church from a young age through my grandmother, who was a church attender and regular communicant. And so she'd sometimes, when she had care of me on particular days, might take me to church, usually perhaps on a Wednesday more so than any other day, because that's when you had your midweek Eucharist. And then also my parents had childcare for a time when I was a toddler. So that person was also a Christian, would take me to the local church toddler group and things like that. So there were interactions with the church, but I wasn't really raised in a Christian household. And it wasn't really until the age of 10 when I sort of heard the local church bell ring one Sunday morning, calling people to church, that I happened to turn to my mother, who was ironing in the kitchen, and I said, I think I'd like to go to church next Sunday. And she sort of looked back at me and said, oh, right, really? Well, it's been some time since I went to church, so maybe there's something we can do together. So the following Sunday, she and I went to church, and I was sort of siphoned off into Sunday school. And we both had a pleasant experience, a welcoming experience. And so we returned week after week. And of course, I was at that age where the vicar sort of was looking at me for confirmation preparation as 10, turning 11. But I hadn't been baptized. So I was prepared for baptism and confirmation at the same time. And I was baptized and confirmed just after my 11th birthday, I think, around about the Feast of Pentecost. And I suppose I found myself in a position where I had this growing sense of wanting to belong to the church, but also had friends who were not church and a family who was not church. So I sort of found myself navigating that somewhat, and particularly perhaps in a context where church going wasn't the popular thing to do, and invited criticisms and things like that. But I found myself being drawn into the life of the church more and more, and which was unusual for somebody my age in the Rhondda Valley. And so as well as serving at the altar on a Sunday, I then found myself going to the evening Eucharist on a Tuesday, which was often followed by a study group, and involvement grew and grew and grew. And it got to a point then when I was around 13, 14, where my incumbent said to me, you spend a lot of time in church for someone your age. It's a bit unusual, isn't it? And I said, yeah, I suppose it is. And he said, before I'm going to ask you a question, and before I ask it, I'm just going to ask you not to say no outright. I want you to think about it and pray about it. So he said, do you think God might be calling you to be a priest? And of course I said no outright. Really, because of course up until that point I wanted to explore being a vet, and I was passionate about wanting to be a vet, and that was the direction of travel. But I found myself really entertaining something that I said to myself I wasn't going to entertain. I kind of said to myself, this is this is a no-go. I want to be a vet, full stop. But there was a niggle inside me that just wouldn't go away, and I thought, oh gosh, there's something in this, and I ended up praying about it and really considering the question, and it got to a point where I then sort of plucked up the courage to say to my mother, do you think God is calling me to be a priest? And she sort of looked up from whatever she was doing, either reading the paper or knitting or something, and she said, well, I don't know, but whatever you decide, your father and I will support you. And so I kind of, in the next breath, said, well, that's it then. I'm going to be a priest. And she sort of looked up and said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, that's it. And she said, well, okay, do what you need to do. So I went back to the incumbent to ask me the question, and I said, look, there might have been something in this, and I perhaps need to explore it. And he said, excellent, let's journey together and see where this leads. So so I suppose it all happened really very quickly, that becoming a Christian and the sort of discipleship stuff, which led then to a realization of a calling to ordain ministry. And I suppose that was all enabled to happen so quickly because my parish priest was an excellent enabler and an encourager. And he provided me with all manner of opportunities to sort of dig deeper and be a part of the ministerial life of the parish, and yeah, and so I think I owe him a debt there really, and I've always kind of sought to model that in some ways if I can, to see potential and to just kind of I think there's a reluctance nowadays among clergy to ask those questions that he asked in the way that he did, and I think perhaps we need to get back to that somehow and be bolder.
I can remember the exact point in my life when I flipped from being the person who was being taken to dinner by clergy who were being kind and formational for me to being the person who started taking people to dinner and having those conversations with them. It's one of the kind of like the definitions of getting old, I think, is when that kind of all it happened overnight on the feast of the Annunciation. But I suppose I hadn't quite realised at that point that that's an important privilege of getting older, isn't it? That opportunity to be a formational person for other people and to be looking out and to be kind of agents of vocation in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's the particular privilege of the priest, I suppose, in some ways, who has oversight of ministry areas and who to be able to spot, nurture, and help people to get to a place where perhaps God is calling them to be, and often they need that prod, don't they? People often don't recognize their own potential, and so God uses us as instruments to perhaps guide them. Yeah.
I just wonder a few other elements to pick out of that story alongside the importance of formational people. Something about the support of family and friends in discerning a vocation and in living out vocation. I guess that I increasingly find myself praying prayers of thanksgiving more for people who support me in ministry without which stuff wouldn't be possible. But and having been a little bit resentful, I think, of questions during a discernment process about what family and friends might think of a vocation, and thinking that was a bit of an intrusion. But there's a substantial degree, isn't there, to which that support, which is often costly, is an important part of a vocation, and I guess that's in a broader sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I plucked up. It took me some time to pluck up the courage to speak to my mother about my sense of vocation, and her response made the world of difference. You know, it was kind of a, I don't know, but we'll support you. And I suppose if everybody could adopt that in a response, I think we won't go far wrong. And I suppose there is this tension, isn't there, about, you know, if you're raised in a family that's not religious, they might not fully understand what it is that you're pursuing, but that's where the church family comes in, really. And so I had several people in my local church who were on board, if you like, and kind of were nudging me and pushing me and encouraging me, and that I think it made up in many ways for perhaps a lack of understanding beyond the church about what it was that I was pursuing, really. Yeah,
I think in part because I'm preaching at the 9:15 this coming Sunday on Christianity and friendship, and have been reflecting on Angela's lovely wise sermon on Christianity and family last Sunday, which I commend to people who were there on the live stream, and those important lessons from the Church of England report that Angela reflected on there, and that sense of the family which we're given. And the need to take care of that, but also to acknowledge the diverse forms of it for different people, and indeed the place of singleness within that, which I thought was an important element of Angela's sermon, but also that sense of the family of the church, and that. I think not to kind of preach the whole sermon before I've even thought about the stone resonance, but there's something about that calling that calling to be a friend in Christ, which is beyond disciple and is beyond brother, sister, sibling, that he calls us friends in the Gospel of John.
Absolutely, yeah. And I must revisit the live stream of the service to catch Angela's sermon.
They are there for all time now, you see. So
absolutely, immortalized. Yeah, for sure. And that's the beauty of the church family, isn't it? That we're such a diverse bunch, and we come with all manner of setups, as it were. But yet we, you know, that we're able to gel as a family of faith in a particular way, in a beautiful way.
Something else to pick out of the narrative of vocation, I think to do with competence, because I suppose that it's possible in life, isn't it, to be called to do things, or to feel a sense of calling to do things at which we'd be no good. And I was kind of loved to be a conductor. I think I kind of fancy myself with my kind of hand waving occasionally, and yet the times that I've tried to do it, it's been just disastrous, and I don't have the aptitude for that sort of command and focus. And I wonder how in terms of your own vocational journey, but also in terms of the work that you now have responsibility for, how that focus on things that we would be good at, as well as things that we feel that we're called to, fits into reflections on vocation and helping others through a discernment process. Yeah,
that's a really interesting one, and a tricky one at times, because, you know, you get people who present for particular ministries, who feel that they have a strong sense of calling to ministry, or to that specific ministry, and the whole business of competency can be a challenge. You know, and when it comes to discerning vocation, the church has criteria against which we assess candidates to help us with that discernment. But it can be a really challenging and painful process for people to hear things about yourself that perhaps you didn't realize, but hopefully to an affirming process whereby they then discover more about themselves that they didn't realize, which has greater potential and sort of, you know, and sort of you need to then, as the person who is overseeing discernment processes or being a friend or somebody who's accompanying someone in discernment and an encourager, you need to try and sort of be able to help them to recognize where their true talent lies and to channel that. But, you know, in the discernment process of the church, we sometimes have to say that this path isn't for you. And so that's a hard thing for people to hear. But nevertheless, what the church doesn't say is that you don't have a vocation. You do. We just need to discover perhaps what that is or where that is that God is calling you to. So yeah, it's an interesting one, really, and can invite challenge and but a greater awareness of what it is that we are good at, and yeah.
Oh, just a last general thing. I think that one of the things that I struggled with was almost the word vocation or calling. I mean, there's a humble person inside me waiting to jump out, and I guess this is that part of it, that sense that God might be calling me or speaking to me directly in a very specific sense. Whereas there were so many other situations in life and in the world where you thought, if there's this direct line from God to individuals that issues commands or makes the divine purpose clear, why isn't God communicating directly to other people about far more important things than to me about my vocation? And I guess I do think that there's a slight danger in our use of calling in too narrow a way. But beyond that, something about desire that I think helped me to reconcile some of that, which I'm grateful to the priest in London who helped me to realize that, and this, I think this might be a Welsh thing, not to do too much stereotyping, but that to say, yes, I want to do this, I have a desire to do it, and that one's desires, the part of a vocational journey, part of the Christian journey is to recognize that desires are God-given, and that there's a conformity that comes with that, which is its own form of calling, and perhaps the kind of highest form of calling.
Yeah, I often get candidates come to me who kind of say, when I ask them, you know, to what do you feel called, and they say, oh, you know, we don't feel we can actually be so bold as to say that God is calling me to be a priest or a reader or whatever it might be. But I think this is what it is. And I kind of say to them, well, look, I totally understand that sort of that sense of feeling you need to approach this humbly, and to perhaps not be to come with 100% degree of confidence that it is right, because of course you're embarking on a discernment process where the church and yourself are discerning together what might, you know, that this is right for the individual and right for the church. But actually, you do need to approach it with a certain level of confidence. And I think that kind of speaks to this desire notion that you talk about. And and I suppose when people say to me, how do you know, David, that God called you to be a priest? How did you experience that? My response is often, prior to realizing that God was calling me to be a priest, I wanted to be a vet, and I was passionate about that. But when I came to terms with or realized that actually God was calling me to be a priest, nothing else made sense. Nothing else made sense. Wanting to be a vet became just insignificant. I didn't even give it a second thought in the end. It just faded away. And it was as though the path ahead was as clear as day, in a sense, that a light had been switched on in some shape or form, to put it like that. I suppose a switch had been flicked, and nothing else mattered, and I just knew I had to pursue it. And so there's a subtlety, I suppose, in all of that, and a bit of an unknowing, but trust plays a huge part, doesn't it, in that journey as well. So yeah.
As somebody who now has a dog who is too old really to be worth the insurance, and it's cheaper to pay than the exorbitant premium, I would encourage people to explore a vocation to be vets, because it seems to me that it's a productive life in some ways.
Feeling exactly the same about the cat.
We might start from pet blessings after all, just in case. Let's reflect a bit on your ministry within the diocese more broadly. You joined us up here a little over a year ago, having been the Diocesan Director of Ordinance in Llandaf previously. How have you found the state of people reflecting on vocations across the diocese in terms of your engagement, and what have been some of the things that have stood out or delighted you as you've been engaging with work, especially around Vocations Sunday this year?
Yeah. As I've sort of journeyed around ministry areas and got to know people and discovered more about, the sort of the landscape of ministry, I suppose, across the diocese, it's been really encouraging to see how ministry area leaders are trying to enable more and more people within their ministry areas to be part of the offering of ministry in those ministry areas. And so we're seeing lots of people show interest in pastoral ministries, and I think it was just before my arrival, we licensed quite a lot of people, didn't we, in the diocese to different lay license ministries, which was encouraging. But actually, there are many ministries exercised in our ministry areas that don't come with a certificate or a bishop's license, that largely are just happening on the ground, and they're encouraging and they're good, and it's delightful to see. So the Vocations Sunday campaign, if we want to call it that, sort of showcased, I think, lots of those ministries that are largely happening at grassroots, that often perhaps don't get celebrated so much, and ministries too that people often don't consider to be ministries. So it's amazing how many musicians, for example, don't think that what they're doing is a ministry, when actually what they're doing is enriching and facilitating worship. We need to, I suppose, one of the things that I wanted to do with the Vocation Sunday initiative, but also just to do more broadly and regularly, is to encourage a culture of ministry and vocation within the diocese, where we enable and encourage everyone to see that perhaps what they're doing now is a wonderful and valued ministry, but also that they might have the potential to offer more in other ways. And yeah, so there's a lot of good going on out there. I think there's also challenges. There are also challenges too, and you know, ministry area leaders have a lot to do. Therefore, it's perhaps harder for ministry area leaders nowadays to give as much time and or the level of commitment needed to do the really good nurture of vocations. And so I suppose that's helped me in many ways to form my mind on this, and that is that actually that shouldn't solely be the responsibility of the ministry area leader. The nurturing of vocations of everyone should be a collective responsibility. So whereas at one time the parish priest would tap somebody on the shoulder and say, look, do you think God is calling you to X, Y, or Z? We should all be doing it. And I try to encourage people when I preach in ministry areas to say to the church family, you know, if you see someone with particular gifts and talents or potential that isn't being realized, have a word with them, you know, tap them on the shoulder and say, look, do you know you're good at this? Perhaps there's something in this and you need to pursue it. So moving away from that one person doing all of the tapping, the planting seeds and the nurturing, to sharing that collectively is perhaps a more effective way of nurturing vocations and nurturing fellow disciples.
A last question for this part. I'm conscious that we tend to talk about vocation a lot as something that happens at the beginning stage of ministry, or indeed of Christian life and calling, but that vocation is a lifelong thing, and the work of discerning is one that changes and needs refreshing.
Yeah.
I know that it's barely 10 years since your confirmation at the age of 11. But as you reflect on your vocation now, on your priestly vocation now, how is it similar, and what are the differences to that vocation which you had that sense of calling to in your teenage years?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but also quite topical in that I initially felt called to what was traditional parish priestly ministry. That's what my vicar modelled, and that's he modelled it in such a way that it was infectious, and I wanted to share in it. And that was I suppose the way in which he was a tremendous pastor and leader shaped me in my early days, and so I suppose that was the model of ministry that I was presented with, and that's what I sought. And to a greater extent in my ministry so far, that's what I did. I was as assistant curate and as associate priest and incumbent in Grangetown. It was a very traditional model of priestly ministry that I exercised. And then I was appointed DDO in the diocese of Llandaff, and that was 70% director of ordinands and 30% team vicar in a rural parish. I'd always said that I didn't feel called to rural ministry, so that was God had a laugh there in a sense, because I ended up in a rural context unexpectedly, because I I was appointed to the DDO post. And so that came with a time of challenge, because I'd moved away somewhat from exercising that traditional model of priestly ministry that I felt called to. And I was in a context that I thought I didn't feel called to. But actually, that transition and that those new experiences didn't. They weren't so bad. I suppose is what I want to say. That I sort of acclimatized well to these new ways of doing things. So my team vicar post in that rural ministry area was very much one where I wasn't based at one particular church, but across a whole ministry area where there were 7 churches in the end. And so that traditional model that I'd adopted wasn't really that possible in that context. And so I had to evolve and adapt and change, and I adjusted, I thought, quite well. Of course, then COVID hit during that time, and so everything went to pot to some degree in terms of how regular ministry operated. And so we responded how we felt best as a team, as a ministry team. And then of course, but the thing about that was that I had 30% of my time was still as a parish priest of some sort within that ministry area. And so I was still doing funerals. I was still presiding at the Eucharist every Sunday and some weekdays. And I did weddings and baptisms and the like. But since taking up this post, much of that has diminished, and quite rightly so, because that was the nature of the role. That's the nature of the role. But over the past year, because I've moved so far away from that original vocation and those pastoral encounters and all of that the pastoral stuff that I loved so much. I have been on a sort of an inner journey, if you like, of asking myself, and is this role where you ought to be? And so I spent a lot of time praying about it and sort of considering, well, have I moved so far away from my original vocation that this isn't actually right? Or, but in my discerning, I've kind of come to a mind that actually God puts us in places that we often don't think we ought to end up in, or perhaps we didn't think we would end up in. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. And that I find joy in the vocations element of my work, the discernment, the nurture, the enabling. And I also find joy in supporting other clergy too, and seeing them develop and because a part of my director of ministry job is the professional development of our clergy, and there's a pastoral element to that, and so I suppose I'm finding my original vocation still affirmed, and my, I suppose another element to this is the fact that I still have a priestly ministry at the cathedral, which is also incredibly helpful, and to be alongside other clergy as well in a team, hugely beneficial, so there are different elements to my work currently that enable me to affirm my vocation, which has changed somewhat from my original the original vocation I sought. Sorry, I was a bit distracted then by a few faces appearing on the screen.
Oh yes, by the delights of parochial priestly ministry.
I saw there was too much nose then, wasn't there?
David, thank you for your conversation with us. That's been very helpful.